We modify microorganisms so that they produce the dyes, but also so that they deposit and fix the dyes onto the fabric. By doing this, we can address both sides of the impact of making the dyes and the impact of applying them.
Hey, stranger, how's it going?
What's going on, Erum? It feels like it's been forever, but it hasn't been.
Well, it's forever in these times because we live in the 3-second attention economy. So 2 weeks seems like eons.
Right. And we've had 2 episodes that we dropped. And I think that's something that we probably will do again in the future. I hosted one with Julie Wolf and you hosted one with Shelby Newsaf. So it was kind of fun. But give me the high level of where you were. Why were you not a host for a couple weeks?
Yeah, I disappeared. No, I didn't disappear. But as you know, I went to Brazil for a wedding and it was beautiful. Floripa, as you know, intimately.
Florianopolis, yeah.
Yes, Florianopolis. So sidebar, for our listeners, you may or may not know that Karl is a writer and he has written a novel about Florianopolis. So he's done a lot of research on this place. So when he found out that I was going there, he shared it with me and wow, it was like as if you lived there for 10 years.
The novel actually doesn't take place in Florianopolis. Florianopolis makes an appearance.
Nice. Cool. Yeah. And it was a great time. And then I've just been holding the fort down when you were gone. So you were on the West Coast. What were you doing? How was it?
So I came out to hike in the desert. It was spring break for Kristen, our teacher, my wife, and Felix, my son. So we rented an Airbnb in Joshua Tree and we hiked in the national park every day for a week. My parents came out, my sister came out. It was like a big compound. We cooked every night. It was a lot of fun. We're recording this. I'm still on the West Coast. I'm in my parents' house. From here, I'm in Ventura. I'm going to do some day trips into LA to meet people we know, and then go up to Symbiodata on Sunday. And then I'll be here for another week.
Yeah, you returned home because you were born and raised in the West Coast.
It always feels like home when I'm here. And I love California, so any Californians or anybody listening should know that. But the only thing that's annoying about California, and Californians probably agree, is the amount of driving that we do. And just to put things into perspective, when I fly to Symbiodata, I'll be flying from Burbank, which is the middle of Los Angeles County, to San Jose, and that's a 90-minute flight. So it's further than New York to Boston. That's a third of the state of California.
Wow.
So it's an enormous state. It's always fantastic to be here, to meet people, to talk to people. I had a great conversation with a science communicator yesterday who lives in LA, loves living there. We talked about how dynamic and creative it can be. So I think we'll see the same thing when we're up in San Jose for Symbiodata next week.
Yes. Yeah. Can't wait. Yeah. And I've been busy heading to different events. One, we had this climate biotech event we mentioned on the podcast before. Shelby attended and a whole bunch of our friends were there. Climate biotech is an absolute necessary field of exploration and discovery and entrepreneurship. And that was really great. We've met 2 of the big organizations that we co-hosted with, which I know you had FOMO. We really missed you. Everyone was asking where you were. But it was a Homeworld Collective, as well as our friend Alex Rose of Cascade Biocatalysts. And they really just rallied the troops. And they knew that we had our finger on the pulse of what's going on in biotech in Brooklyn. So we were able to invite some of our friends from the Brooklyn Biotech Mafia. And it was just so much fun. But I'll say, not really, because you weren't there. So we did miss you, Karl, and we did talk about you. So if your ears were ringing, it was because you were missed.
First of all, it looked like so much fun. I had massive FOMO, but I was hiking. And also, Erum, kudos to you because you got off the airplane, you did that event, and then you did another event, you barely had recovered from your trip to Florianopolis, and you were straight into the fire.
Yeah. I went straight into the fire.
Yeah. How many people were at the climate event?
There was about 80 people that RSVP'd, and I would say about 50 actually showed up to the new lab, which is in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So it is a hike for some of these people, but they made it because they were just so compelled to talk to other people about climate biotech and what they're doing in the space. And so lots of fun. And then a big event that happened was Breaking into Biotech. It's a program to reskill adults that want to come into biotech. And it's led by GenSpace, which, of course, you're on the board, and GenSpace holds a special place in our hearts. as well as the NYC EDC. And there is an organization that focuses on labor markets out of CUNY that really came together to ensure that these people who are interested in biotech have the skills, or they start learning what they need to learn in order to continue exploring. So it is a crash course, I would say, but a very intense one. 3 months, 3 days a week from 6:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. I was just amazed by these people. And what we did was a panel discussion. It was myself, Karl and Erum, who you're very good friends with, artist, biologist. Interesting. She comes from the world of marketing and advertising, but spent a lot of her career exploring biology and biotech. And then also our friend Chui Lian from Wearable. She is the CEO and co-founder of Wearable, an alternative materials company based out of Brooklyn. And we had a great conversation, which was moderated by Stephen Reddy, who is a force in the biotech space. He has a lot of experience in biopharma and really is connecting a lot of people across biopharma, synthetic biology, and definitely a kindred spirit. So we really missed you, Karl, at that event.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Stephen, shout out to you. Stephen puts out an event list every week, or maybe 2 lists of investor events and biotech events that take place in the New York City area. He's easy to find on LinkedIn, so he's a fantastic resource. I definitely had some FOMO last week. I tried to temper it as I was sweating and climbing, going down these trails in Joshua Tree, and then visiting these like interesting art installations that are around the Joshua Tree desert. In particular, there's a huge statue called Transmission, which was very inspiring. It's like this concrete statue on the top of a hill. It's like someone's head. It's 4 hands facing each other, just really inspiring, but inspiring in a different way.
Yeah.
And I was joking around that I had 2 lists I was keeping while I was in the desert. One was biotech companies that only can exist in the desert. So I have a list of those.
Nice.
And then the other funny, typical LinkedIn post is something about resilience and what I learned from hiking challenging trails in the desert.
Oh, I would love to talk about that. I mean, do you want to share one company that you came up with that you got inspired by desert conditions, or that only thrive in the desert?
So this is not an original idea. And there is someone in our network who I feel like I don't really know very well, Peter Yeadon. He's a professor at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. And he's talked about they're basically like sponges that absorb water. I believe he's helped develop them for space applications. But I was thinking about how those could be applied in the desert to absorb water from the air. So one of the things I kept thinking about was like, how could you use those water absorbing foams to turn the desert into a forest?
Speaking my language, you're talking about terraformation.
Exactly.
That's what we're talking about. Okay, cool. All right. We definitely need to save that rabbit hole for another episode, because this whole episode can be about that. But we have a great guest we want to introduce, and there's some news we need to talk about. When I was at the Breaking into Biotech event, Stephen Reddy told me about some news that broke recently about how the ex-Stanford president, who was under a lot of heat and is accused of forging data for research studies, he recently pulled in $1 billion in venture capital to create an AI drug discovery platform. And I'm like, what? $1 billion for an AI drug discovery platform? What? First of all, what is this platform? What have they discovered? What new biologies and new technology? I mean, besides AI, I know it's just a broad term now that we've been digging into it. And why $1 billion? What is everyone smoking? Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this, Karl?
So I saw that same news, and my first reaction was, this will fail. And I wish I had more data points to pull from. And honestly, I don't want them to fail, but it is a lot of money. As we were talking about discussing this on the podcast, I just pulled some data up from Boston Consulting Group. They did a study a couple of years ago where they studied from 2010 to 2021 AI-intensive drug companies. And what they figured was from all these companies, there was only 15 candidates that had made it into the clinical stage. So you've got 20 companies working for 11 years and only 15 candidates. Now, that's not a reflection of the companies themselves, because drug discovery is very challenging. It's not just the drug. It's not just the molecule. You have to get it into the clinic. You have to design trials. And actually, one of the bottlenecks for drug development is getting the drug into the clinic. And that in itself is a science that needs AI applied to it. So $1 billion for a AI drug discovery company seems a little outrageous when I think most of the companies are probably raising between 50 and 100 to maybe 2 or $300 million. I wish them the best of luck. And I would love our listeners to chime in on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what it's about is the amount of money that they are putting in to one company when there are hundreds of AI drug discovery companies. So there's something there. We don't know the details of what this company is specifically doing or what advantages they have. They have some of the biggest names as a part of their cap table. So the investors that are putting money in must have some insight into what's going on. So let's just see. And like my big question here is like, why $1 billion? It's just $1 billion in commitments. It's not like the checks were signed. I don't want to like make this a big hype story and blow it out of proportion, which often happens in the news. We're not a news podcast. We're just talking about what's going on in biotech so people understand. But this is a big story just in terms of someone that might have a little bit of controversy can still get a lot of money from big names and work on something that other people have been working on. But unfortunately, they don't have those big names and those connections to pull that much money. And maybe it's because they don't need it. Because if this is $1 billion in venture capital, they're at least expecting $10 billion in revenue from this AI drug discovery startup. So are they going to be then obviously making drugs to sell? Because that is where you make the money. You're not just a software company. Pfizer's going to pay you to use your software. No, you're going to be making drugs if you're expecting to make $10 billion.
Yeah, just to put a couple of things into perspective, Elon Musk has raised something like $10 billion for his AI company, but Musk has also been training Teslas on how to drive. They've got a robotics company. There's a lot of data that they've been generating and using to train this company. So $10 billion, while outrageous, is not really outrageous for an Elon Musk company. And as much as people are Elon Musk detractors, I think it's very hard to bet against him given his successes. The other thing to put this into perspective is that if you're saying this company is worth $10 billion, Bayer, the global pharmaceutical company, has a market cap of almost $30 billion. Roche has a market cap of $30 billion. So for this company to come out of nowhere and to achieve 10 billion, which is a relatively conservative market cap based on that investment, is pretty bold.
I'm curious to know how much money Pfizer and Bayer needed to raise in order to get to that level of success. I mean, sure, it's billions over years, but was it billion in one shot? So maybe it is.
Not, because these are old companies. They've been around for 100 years.
Yeah.
They built their market cap the hard way. They bootstrapped it and sold a lot of drugs along the way.
Yeah. Yep. So it remains to be seen. We'll keep an eye on the story. This was a story that was shared with me by Stephen Reddy at Breaking Through Biotech. We were talking about it for a bit of time, but that wasn't the only thing because we're talking about everything across biopharma and bioindustrials and biomaterials. Pfizer, being a big biopharma company, was started in New York City. New York City is a hub for not only startups, but biotech startups. We talk about it all the time. And one of the companies that was on the panel with me was, as I mentioned, Chui Lian from Wearwool. So Wearwool is a biomaterials company. Very interesting with their approach using fermentation technologies. We talk about biomaterials all the time. We had some amazing companies that we've interviewed on this podcast, from Sway, Polybion, Material.
Suzanne Lee.
So biomaterials meaning fabrics, materials making a coating, but then there's also dyes. How can dyes be made through biomanufacturing? And what does it take to make it? And so we are very excited to introduce this episode where we interview Orr Yarkoni of Colorifix. And Karl, you've known Orr for a few years. How did you meet him? And can you tell us a little bit more about Colorifix?
Yes. Colorifix is a company that specializes in a novel way of dyeing clothing. As you mentioned, dyeing clothing is actually very bad for the environment. But what Orr has done is they've developed a biological, I think even bacterial way of dyeing materials. And not only have they developed the dyes themselves, but they also have machines that look like big washing machines that they put on site at the textile manufacturers to dye the clothing. So I think it's a very interesting model, not just because it's a biological dye, but also because it's the machine for making the dye possible. And in the end, and we'll talk about, the process uses a lot less water than traditional dyes. One of the issues with dyes today is that they use an incredible amount of water. I think to dye a t-shirt takes something like 2,500 liters of water, and there's hundreds of millions of t-shirts made every year. So every one of those colored t-shirts takes a huge amount of water to produce, and that's not even counting the cotton or the polyester, which is an oil-based material. I think having Orr on the podcast is a great thing because he'll give us more insight into the issues associated with dyeing clothing or textiles and how he and his company have overcome those challenges. So let's let Orr take it away. Orr Yarkoni, we are so pleased to have you on the Grow Everything podcast today. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here with you, Karl and Erum.
So we've known each other for a little bit of time, I feel like. We keep running into each other at events. Can you give us a little bit of background on yourself and then your company, Colorifix?
So my name is Orr Yarkoni. My background is in synthetic biology. So bit of molecular biology before synthetic biology really took off into more mainstream science. Did my master's in nanomaterials and nanofabrication, so a lot of surface chemistry. And then did my PhD and postdoc on biosensors, so interfacing cells with the environment and trying to get them to interact. And then from there on to Colorifix, where we were originally applying our biosensor work, myself and my co-founder, Jim, in South Asia, where we were measuring the amount of heavy metal in drinking water using biology as a sensor for whether the water was at toxic levels of arsenic. And when we were there, we asked people, what else is in your water that bothers you? And through that exercise, we came to realize the extent of the impact of the textile industry, and particularly the wet processing and dyeing steps in processing fabric. We realized that we had a microorganism that would change color if the water wasn't safe to drink. Wouldn't it be great if we could change the color of the fabric instead of measure how much pollution that process is making? And that was the inspiration.
Wow, that is incredible. Can you talk a little bit about this microbe? How was it a biosensor, and did you have to change it at all to have a new application?
So this was for the arsenic biosensor collaboration, the collaboration between the University of Cambridge, Edinburgh, and local stakeholders in Nepal in the form of ENFO, a water and air quality NGO. We were developing a bacillus-based biosensor that it would change color. The thresholds of arsenic went above the 10 ppb WHO current standard, the 50 ppb WHO previous standard, and 200 ppb to denote heavy contamination. So it was designed in a stoplight fashion. So you had different lights that would turn on at different thresholds. It was an engineered microorganism with a credit card-sized container that would be self-filling and self-leveling. So you dip it in the water, incubate it between 30 and 37. So basically recommended in the pocket. And then you could take the reading within 24 hours. It included a negative and incubation control to make sure that you've incubated for enough time to read the result. And ultimately, it showed to be quite efficient. The problem is regulation and funding a product that doesn't produce significant revenue or profit. So that's part of the journey into Colorifix, realizing that in order to really solve a problem, you need to provide a solution that isn't just good, but that does well on the market. In order to get the backing, you need to actually create real impact. That was a lesson that was hard to learn, but important and very helpful to Colorifix's journey.
Now, you mentioned that you asked people what else was bothering them about their water, and they mentioned dyes from the textile industry. How does traditional textile dyeing work, and how does it impact the environment?
So in conventional dyeing, you're doing two activities really. First, you're producing the dyes. So you're processing petrochemicals into the fine chemicals you intend to use, the colorant. Then there's the impact of actually dyeing, and that's where you add the colorant, other chemicals to help the colorant interact with the fabric, and lots of water, salts, and other chemistry to help the reaction take place. And then you boil it at high temperature for a long time. So basically, you're creating a fairly toxic soup, lots of it, to get the colors to stick to the material. The industry uses roughly 700,000 tons of colorants a year, out of which roughly 200,000 tons end up in effluent. So the transfer process is fairly inefficient. The industry uses upward of 70 other fairly toxic chemicals to get the dyes to stick. Over 30 of those are irretrievable, meaning no matter what your waste management strategy is, those will end up in the water if they're not disposed of by incineration or other means. Beyond that, the industry uses trillions of liters of water, and the figure will vary depending on which report you read, but there's a lot of consensus around roughly 5 trillion liters of water being used for wet processing in textile manufacturing, and most of that for dyeing. Again, on the emissions, you'll have varying reports of between 17 and 7% of carbon emission contribution coming from textiles. And that will really depend if you're looking at just the manufacturing or all the transport, supply chain, and retail activity before the end consumer receives the item.
Wow, that's a lot of processing and inefficiency. It's incredible. I have a background in biotech and more biopharma, and I worked in tech for a while. And as soon as I started working with Karl and going to biofabricate, I've heard you speak a couple times. I didn't realize that petrochemicals made dyes, whether they're food dyes or dyes for our clothing. And it's just insane that this was even created this way.
It's really interesting because if you look at the history of chemicals, two of the largest, Bayer and BASF, actually started as dye houses, right? The Bayer Ash and Soda Factory is BASF, and that was literally a dye house and a producer of dyes. The chemical industry, as we know it today, owes a lot to the textile industry, and even to this date, between 20 and 25% by volume of chemistry goes towards textiles. Depending on the product, you can get up to 1.2 kilos of chemical to process 1 kilo of fabric before you wear it. Wow. So it's a phenomenal amount of chemistry going on, from the material to the processing to the finishing to even putting a scent on so that it smells nicer in the store. Everything adds to the impact.
Unreal. You had this sensor. You guys realized that there was an issue with dyes, and so you pivoted to make Colorifix. What does Colorifix do, and how does it offer a more sustainable alternative to this very toxic dye problem that we're dealing with?
So when we were working on the biosensor, again, we had a bacteria that changed color if the water wasn't safe to drink. And then from there, the inspiration point was, can we transfer the color to the fabric? Because what Colorifix does is provide biological dyeing. We modify microorganisms so that they produce the dyes, but also so that they deposit and fix the dyes onto the fabric. By doing this, we can address both sides of the impact of making the dyes and the impact of applying them. And it's actually on the application that you see most of the savings, because that's where you use a lot of water, a lot of energy, and a host of other chemicals rather than just the processing of the petrochemical to the final compound. So what we do is find colors in nature. We, instead of extracting the pigment from the natural context, we borrow the information of how it's made, meaning the DNA sequence. We engineer our microbes to make these same pigments the same way they're made in nature, meaning starting from sugar and nitrogen and building all of the biochemistry towards making the colorant. What's special about Colorifix is post-fermentation, there is no downstream processing. We harvest everything from the fermenter into the dye machine. So what comes out of the fermenter is literally the dye liquor. In some cases, it's diluted even, but there's no downstream processing for our main product lines in dyeing. There's some level of downstream processing for printing, but that's a separate application that we're working on as well. There is no binders, linkers, mordants, any of the traditional auxiliary chemistry to have the dye stick to the fabric. All of that is done using biology. So that helps us a lot in the impact. And because the process is done roughly at body temperature for the most part, with a brief temperature spike to inactivate the microorganism, and we use less water per kilo of fabric, you end up saving a lot on water and energy and the total amount of pollution you make. And on the matter of pollution, it's really important, obviously. There is no change to the waste stream management in the textile industry. They already do everything necessary to handle our waste type. In fact, we've been deemed safe for direct discharge. So they've been assessed by water quality authorities over the last few years, and they found that this is safe enough to even potentially put down the drain, despite that not being something we advertise doing industrially. We still want the three-phase EPC, just as the industry does today, as any shortcuts can lead to disastrous consequences for the environment.
Now, you had said that on the traditional chemistry side, it's like 1.25 kilograms of chemicals for every kilogram of textile processed. How does your process compare to that? Is there a direct comparison?
So it will depend on which product. The example that we were discussing then is on polycotton, which takes the most processing. There are fabric types that take less. Overall, we've shown 65% reduction in the total chemistry used for dyeing. And all of the chemistry used is green chemistry, meaning nothing hazardous going into the process. We see a reduction between 77 and 78% in water consumption, 19% on energy. And this is factoring that we're measuring making and applying the dyes versus just applying the dyes. That's spectacular. We're saving 31% on carbon emissions.
Wow.
Amazing.
The ESGs, I mean, though it's very controversial at this stage, but you're checking off a lot of boxes. So congratulations on that front. I really loved how you said we borrow information from nature. Can you talk a little bit more about how you borrow information to make specific colors, and what type of colors do you borrow, like a red from a rose and then make it? Like, can you tell us a little bit more about that biological reasoning behind that?
Great question, and it's core to what we do. So nature makes lots of colors, and it makes them in different ways. For our process, we're looking at specifically pigments and dyes. So it's a chemical molecule that will confer that property of color to any material. There's structural color, for instance, like you see on butterfly wings and peacock feathers. There is fluorescence and luminescence, but those don't have the properties necessary for textiles because they need to be wash fast, light fast. They need to have the same quality as the products that we're replacing. So key to what we do is not just find colors, but find colors that have the required performance to truly replace the products and not just look pretty. So light fastness is the biggest barrier for most natural dyes, as they don't have the same resilience to UV. So to give you an example, the best performing natural purple dye that was been available to the industry historically had a light fastness score of 0.5 out of 5. The industry standard is 3/4 or above, so 3.5 or above. Our first purple gave us a score of 2.5, and we now have one that scores above the industry standard. And that's looking at colors that, again, are only present in nature and finding ones that meet the performance to truly replace these products on textiles and not just have something that looks good. Because if you make something greener that doesn't last as long, it's not actually more sustainable. It's just a bit greener.
What does that look like, or when you guys are out looking for these colors? What's your source? Is there a preferred source? I mean, nature has so many places where we can look to find colors. Tell me what that mining process looks like for you guys.
So we look for pigments and dyes that have been historically trialed from fungi, plants, and other sources that are easily accessible and have been tried for hundreds, if not thousands of years. A great example for this is indigo, one of the most used dyes on the planet. But there's lots of diversity in indigo plants. You'll see different shades of indigo. There's more than one product in the plant that gives color. And we actually have, I believe, 18 different color variants of indigo, ranging from greens to grays to even pinks and purples and blues, the traditional one. Indigo is also found in other places in nature. It's interesting that nature solves the same problem the same way in different places. And that can sometimes be useful for marketing. So as an example, one of the colors that we've developed previously, the organism that we found the sequence in was a microorganism that is often found in decomposing vegetable matter. Narrative-wise, for people to wear, this color comes from garbage doesn't sound great. But you can also find the same exact compound in archaeobacteria growing in geysers, which from a marketing narrative is much more appealing. So guess which one we use? But the fact is, it's the same pathway, the same pigment, and we get to cherry pick a little bit based on where nature provides that for us.
Amazing.
So that's on the scoping part. And then we decide, okay, this looks like a good candidate, pigment or dye. And the difference between those, just for definition's sake, is really solubility. Once we decide we want to develop this, we look at all the different instances in nature where it's made, pick which contexts we want to use, so which genes, which regulators we want to put in. We make a host of strains based on that pathway. We screen to get a strain that makes the color, and that's the first part, so making the dye-producing organism. Then, because our process works on lots of materials, it's not locked to just naturals or synthetics. We can do polyester, cotton, silk, wool, nylon, etc. That means we then need to test that color against every material and then check the performance of every material, because sometimes we develop a color that gives performance on, say, cotton and polyester, but not nylon or wool. So then we need to develop a different product of the same color range for these other materials. There's a huge amount of work that goes into qualifying the products that we develop and make sure that they fit the customer need, because the last thing you want is to tell the customer, I have exactly what you're looking for, and then they tell you, this doesn't work for me at all. That's the worst message you can get, and it will impact your growth and market penetration. So we focused a lot on making sure that the quality of the products we're providing to the industry meet or beat the standards of the products you're using today.
You know what you say in terms of like, we've developed these dyes, we have to customize them based on the material that you're going to be dyeing. That would be the case with chemical dyes anyway. It's not one size fits all kind of thing, just so that it's clear to our listeners.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, today in conventional dyeing, you need different chemicals, different machines, and different settings for each one of these materials. For us, it's actually one set of settings, one set of products to do all of these different materials. It's just we replace which is the cartridge in the printer, as it were, if it's going to be polyester or cotton, etc. But the process is the same, and we can use the process regardless of equipment or stage of production. So yarn, fabric, garment, or print, natural or synthetic. The versatility is one of the key features for the customer of what they can do with the technology.
That's great. I think one of the things that would be really helpful to know is, can you tell us a bit more about your customer and the industry? Are you selling to textile houses? Do you work with fashion brands? Where do you fit? And who are you selling to?
When you look at the supply chain from us, looking up and down in the process, the dye house is where the activity is going to take place. There, we do direct sales of the hardware that they'll use to run the process, meaning fermentation, because we do fermentation on the customer site where it's going to be used. We also sell the media, meaning the food for the microorganisms, so that to ensure the product quality and sustainability, we have all of our ingredients and products certified with a leading industry certifier, Ecotex, to the highest standard. And that includes the media provided for production. So to the dye house, direct sales and the hardware and the media. We make a partnership with the mill, which is the primary and many times the only customer for that dye house. From there, we take a royalty, and I won't go into a lot of details there. Ultimately, this is to service the brands who are looking for more sustainable ways to produce products for their customers, who are the average consumer, who is finally demanding more sustainability.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
You have these dye houses, and one of the big things that we've been seeing when it comes to fermentations is that there's a lot of challenges scaling up technology. So what are some of the challenges that you've encountered, and any advice that you have for other people that are using fermentation to serve an industry?
Absolutely. That was a huge step for us. A lot of biotech and synbio applications are, I wouldn't say easy, but much more feasible to get to a proof of concept stage. The scaling up, the technical challenge of fermenting at scale, the costs involved in scaling up, and the infrastructure required generally is incredibly expensive and can take a very long time to set up. And that's even when you're only looking at one product. In our case, we need to make every color for every material. So that's a lot of different products and different fermentation SOPs that need to be followed. We never wanted to go and do fermentation ourselves. We were looking for the customer to buy hardware from existing suppliers, use their tech support. And what we saw early on is that each dye house/mill was looking at different fermentation equipment at different scales from different makes. And if we were to go forward that way, we'd need to develop different solutions for every customer because their process is slightly different. The solution would have to be slightly different as well. That would kill the scalability faster than anything else would, because if our team isn't solving the same problems for every customer, our team has no chance of making the customer happy. Beyond that, as we mentioned, fermenters are quite expensive. So for commodity chemicals like dyes and pigments, the capex involved is simply too expensive to make it viable. So we decided to own the problem and actually distribute hardware to the customer. So it's always the same hardware, and our team is working to the same process and standards at each location. We made it a little bit easier for the customer to use because the goal isn't for our fermentation scientists to operate the machines, it's for dye house machine operators to operate the machines. That involves getting a lot more automation in place and making sure that we minimize all of the maintenance and consumables required to run fermenters. So removing the need for filters, removing the need for parts that you need to take apart between cleaning cycles, and streamlining everything so you have the minimum amount of downtime possible. As a result, customers that are using our hardware have basically 2 to 2.5 hours downtime between batches. This is because everything is steam in place, clean in place, and almost entirely automated now. We've had really good feedback in that we now have teams at dye houses routinely running the fermentations with remote assistance only. And this is just occasional beginning of the week to go over the plan and any issues that they have. So hardware was a big one. In our case, because we don't have any downstream processing, we don't need to centralize to make better use of the CapEx. We can just distribute the hardware to where it's going to be used. That's a big advantage, because otherwise we need to open a 300 million plant and wait the years until it's up and running and then start sales, which is a long time and carries a lot of risk, which is, again, an area where a lot of biotech and synbio companies stumble after the valley of death. There's the desert afterwards.
And just to put things into perspective, how many dye houses are there in the world? Number one. And number two, what kind of reaction do you get from them when you go in and you talk about, hey, we've got this new hardware, it's going to make your process more sustainable?
As far as number of dye houses, it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly, because even brands that are trying to trace their supply chain and spend billions on tracing their supply chain only have visibility on the tier 1 vendors, and dyeing and dye houses are considered tier 2 vendors. As a global estimate, there's between 4,000 and 7,000. That is a wide range. And it really depends on whether you count 2 dye houses belonging to the same group as 2 individual dye houses or not. But in any case, it is in the thousands, but under tens of thousands for dye houses. And then you have a larger number of mills than dye houses as well.
And just to be clear, the mills are where the textile is being woven?
So the mill are the ones that own the textile. So typically, depending on what fiber you're talking about, it will go through a spinner, weaver, and then it will go to the mill. And then from there, it'll go to the cut, trim, sew factory. While it's at the mill, it will typically go to the dye house for certain processing and finishing, and then it will go over to the factory to be cut into the final garment that we wear.
Amazing.
Yeah, and when you're mentioning hardware, you're talking about a fermenter, or is it also safe to say a bioreactor? Can we call it that too?
No, it is essentially a bioreactor. It's aerobic fermentation that we focus on, and the instrument is compatible with other biotech applications as well.
Okay, yeah, because I wanted to get to that in a second. How big of a bioreactor are we talking about? Like how many liters?
So we currently provide 2 models for the customer. We're working on further scale up to the next stage, but at present we offer 300 liter and 3000 liter.
And then just to wrap up that last question, you mentioned that it's applicable to other SynBio applications. And I really want to dig into that because that SynBio beta last year, you brought this up. You talked about your approach. You talk about the bioreactors. I would love to learn about what you were thinking behind that. What type of SynBio applications first came to your mind? And are you working with other SynBio company today?
So there's a couple of companies that have approached us since, and we're trying to set up the project. Again, we have a lot of demand on the textile side, which we can't really sacrifice. And some of these companies need more time to put the funding together for their purchases. The application space is in aerobic fermentation specifically at this stage. One of the partners is looking at other types of fermentation because our mixing technology is applicable to non-air mixtures of gases. So we're looking to explore that as well. But at present, we're focusing on aerobic fermentation, works for both minimal and rich media, works across yeasts, both gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. We validate across a host of different pathways that we ferment routinely as part of our work. I think those are the key ones. We don't do solid state fermentation or filamentous fungi at this point, but we know that this is an exciting area. And maybe in future, we'll work on the hardware for that. But at present, we really need to focus on making sure it works as well as possible for our direct customers. And a lot of those needs are the same as most SynBio companies have. The advantages with the hardware are the lower maintenance costs, as well as less replaceable consumers, as well as a drastically lowered price point, as we're selling the 300 liter for 150,000 euros to Biotech, the 300, and the 3,000 for 300,000 euros.
Just so that our listeners have a picture of what these looks like, correct me if I'm wrong, or I seem to remember the picture you showed, they kind of look like an oversized washing machine.
Kind of, to an extent. There's a lot of elegant tubing involved, but in essence, you needed to mix the liquid and the air together, keep temperature, monitor pH, and a lot of the clever stuff is actually in the dashboard that you press the buttons on to make everything work seamlessly.
So maybe more like a complicated stove washing machine together. Yeah. And these machines would be very similar to what someone at a dye house would be used to using anyway.
Correct. I mean, dye machines, essentially, the only difference is you're not monitoring air. You're monitoring pH, temperature, pressure, all the rest of the stuff, as well as the color at the end. And same type of risk, same type of operation. It's just different equipment for a different purpose.
Amazing.
It is also a less toxic processing. So I bet the teams and the workforce at these dye houses are just thrilled that they have a more sustainable process. And I don't know if you know about any of the effects that people at traditional dye houses experience with this toxic process. I mean, is that a situation?
The impact is noticeable, and it really depends on where in the world you're doing it, what the local practices and regulations are as to how much of a difference it makes for health and safety and for the workforce. A lot of the chemicals used today are harmful to humans and the environment. They are using extremes of pH, with the amounts of soda ash being quite alarming, to say the least. When spillages happen, people get hurt. In our case, unless the temperature is high, that's not going to happen. That's a big advantage for us. One of the things that we do as part of our certification is we test for cytotoxicity, skin contact dermatitis, and allergenicity as part of the certification. And we do that on what comes out of the fermenter going to the dye machine, meaning the liquid. We do that on the fabric, which is the person who's going to wear at the end, and on the waste that comes out as well, to make sure at no point is something toxic inadvertently being made or deposited either in the waste or the material that people wear.
I am curious. I know you've been scaling up. How long you guys been operational?
So we started the company in 2016, actually timed with SynBio Beta to make the announcement. We raised our first funding round in December 2018. We were 4 people at the time. Since then, our team's grown to over 100 now. and raised a considerable amount of funding and developed quite a significant amount of products at this point.
Okay, that's what I'm really interested in. I mean, obviously, congratulations. The growth is amazing. It takes a lot of work. And the fact that you have a team of 100 people sings volumes on your leadership. So congratulations on all of that. I am really curious about the product. So like, what is the most popular material that you're dyeing? Is this clothing on the market? Or can you tell us a little bit more about how consumers can see Colorifix in the market today?
We've had a few product launches. First notable one was this Pangaya in 2021, November. We've somewhat recently had a release with Volback as well. I believe there may be some items left in sizes that are not so popular. But we are currently doing production on a couple of other things, which I can't unfortunately go into because brands like to talk about their own releases. As far as materials and demands, I would say that our product range is currently widest for synthetics like polyester and polycotton. I would say it's weakest for cotton, with wool and nylon being somewhere in between those. So as a factor of that, we are seeing more demand for recycled polyester and recycled polycotton. We try to funnel whenever it goes synthetic, we want it to be recycled synthetic rather than virgin whenever possible. We know that brands have some exceptions to this, particularly looking at some of the new formulations for polyester products that make it biodegradable and non-microplastic forming. So we're working with a company called Ocean Safe who make a saltwater degradable polyester. So we're quite excited about that.
Amazing. You guys have been around since the late 2000 teens. And in that time, have you guys formed any strategic partnerships or collaborations that you could talk about?
Absolutely. H&M has been a key partner for us. They believed in us early and invested in our first Series A and have continued investing as we grow. They've been really great at introducing us to different players in the supply chain to have a better understanding of the customer needs and pains, as well as all of the different sustainability initiatives that are taking place in the industry and how we can best integrate with the existing efforts, because that's always a value add if you can show the customer how you're solving a pain they are already trying to solve, rather than highlight a pain from an angle that they're not looking at it. It's been really useful. Beyond that, we've been fortunate to receive investment from impact investors that are helpful in establishing the LCAs and metrics that we should be collecting, as well as some in the synbio and biotech area to, again, help us on recruiting and network and potential collaborations, such as we have with Basecamp at this point.
Great. Congratulations on that. So here's a question for you. Of all the colors, which one is the most popular and which one's your favorite? So which one's by popular, I mean the one that you sell the most or that makes the most amount of textiles? And then which one's your favorite color?
So of the color range we currently have, the most popular is the blue. In the textile industry, the colors by rank are pretty much black, navy, and white, make up between 70 and 75% of all products sold. And the rest is the rest of the colors. So black is a big priority for us. We don't have a black that has the performance we want just yet. The blue is taking off well, and we have a blue for cotton and a blue for polyester and polycotton as well. And we have a new blue coming out for nylon, and we have a blue for wool as well. So blue is one of the colors that we have solved for most materials already. Black is the biggest priority. After that, I would say red is the other big one because we don't have a good performing red. We have a good pink, we have a good yellow, we have a good blue, and those make the primary colors for mixing. And just like with conventional pigments, we can mix the colors to achieve the desired hue.
And black is a challenge, right?
Black is a challenge for a number of reasons, in that most of the instances of black that you see in nature are either structural or constantly recycled color, meaning a product that fades and the organism is making more of on a continuous basis. There are some exceptions. Some of them don't have the fastness properties. Others have cytotoxicity properties that make them less amenable for the industry, but they'll have other applications. And the most famous black is obviously melanin, which is used throughout nature. And that is actually a combination of pigment and structure because it's a polymer that's being formed. We've had some things that look black. They don't perform as we like. And it's just a matter of time until we have a black we do like.
Yeah, I'm under the impression that black is the harshest color for dyeing, harshest on the environment. Is that true?
Yes, again, the degree of impact will vary on what you're dyeing. Is dyeing cotton black and dyeing polyester black and dyeing nylon black are different things. But all of the black recipes are the most chemical intensive. They tend to be the longest running in the machine because you're trying to get as much color onto the fabric as possible and the highest temperatures with the most other added chemicals. So it is the worst one. And the new EU guidelines are actually phasing out some of the top selling black products and pigments on the market, not just from manufacturing, but from being sold within the market. So there's going to be a big scramble for the next black in the industry.
Wow.
Wow, that's amazing. The cynic in me is like, how do we turn the ban of black into a cultural war issue? We can't.
The reality is the fact that black being banned is the result of a cultural war already. It's been a couple of decades of environmentalists fighting for improved standards, particularly in fashion and particularly in wet processing, starting, I believe, in 97 with the Greenpeace Fashion Report, which named and shamed quite a few brands in their supply chain. And since then, there's been increasing and growing pressure, both internally from within the industry and externally by consumer and regulator on what products and how production takes place. I think it is a good thing that we're seeing some of these products phased out. I think whilst these highly polluting and cheap alternatives are available, there will be less drive to adopt sustainable production means. So we need to phase those out as a prerogative, as a species, in order to give the planet a fighting chance.
Yeah, you mentioned black, navy, and white being the primary colors that are being used in the fashion industry. And that is the color of Karl's wardrobe, too. That's the only colors that he has. That's why he's so concerned about the black dye, because that's all he wears. Being a New Yorker, of course. I actually went down a little rabbit hole in my brain when you're talking about the bioluminescent and the fluorescent colors that are found in nature. Did you and your research team play around with that at all? Is it a structural color?
In that case, it's a fluorescent color. We can make glow-in-the-dark fabric. That's not an issue. The problem is when you put it in the washing machine, that effect comes off entirely.
Oh, okay.
Those colors come as an effect of the protein that's on the fabric rather than a chemical compound. And when you put it in your washing machine with detergent, which is proteases, it will just break down the protein. So we have made these things in the past. It does work. You can make a glow, but as soon as you kill it and wash it, then it comes off the fabric. So it's a wear once kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And that goes against what we're trying to do.
Right, I see. Can we do like a skunk works and make like a coating that protects the proteins so they don't wash off, and just we'll have a small company on the side that makes fluorescent and bioluminescent clothing?
The coating is an interesting one there. The coatings that are currently used by the industry are also being phased out, particularly the hydrophobic ones, which would be protecting things like what you're discussing. So there are solutions needed in that area too, not just for potential fluorescent colors, but for existing products on the market where the finishing products are being phased out and there are no great alternatives still available.
We know some companies that are working on it, right, Karl?
Yeah.
The company is called Material. Have you heard of Material?
She was at Biofabricate with us.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. I don't know if that's waterproof coating, but I'm guessing. I don't know how they're doing it. And I wonder if our friends at Checker Spot are working on something. But anyway, see, this is what happens. I just go down. You say bioluminescence, something I'm a very big fan of. I went more in our world, besides just in plants, that, yeah, Light Bio made their plant. I know there's a bunch of other companies that are now making bioluminescent plants. But as a color in clothing, so interesting.
Yeah, no, definitely continue to be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Orr, as we kind of wind up the interview, what do you see as being the future of biotech in the next 3, 10, 30 years? How does what you're doing evolve and affect textiles?
Well, I think we will see much of the same type of evolution that we've seen thus far. Basically, the 80s, we started engineering microbes to make pharmaceuticals. It took roughly 30 years for us to see applications outside of that and start to grow the application space. I think over the next 3 to 5 years, we'll see a host of diverse products that are manufactured biologically, showing proof of concept and examples of how to introduce biological manufacturing to different verticals. I hope that in 10 years' time, those will be successful and will spawn competition and new product verticals trying to compete with those biomanufactured products. And I hope that in 30 years' time, much like has happened with pharmaceuticals, half or more of production of day-to-day goods that do not need to last forever and that we need to eat or wear, we make biologically. That is, I believe, the future, because nature's shown that the only carbon economy that really works sustainably is sugar. Any other form of carbon that you can't make using sunlight ultimately doesn't last forever. Otherwise, nature would be using that instead.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Was there anything that we didn't cover that you think we should have asked you today?
I think we went over the impact. We went over what we're doing, how that's different. It's a very interesting conversation about color overall. The last thing I will probably want to mention is that one of the cool and kind of weird things that we do is that we can harvest color from any natural context. And the industry so far has only had available a context that's scalable to them, meaning plants, minerals, certain insects are the only ways you could extract color naturally so far. And we can extract it from any context, be it a microbe, an insect that's so tiny and has that pigment in milligrams, and we scale everything the same way. So a lot of the pigments and dyes that we're working with are ones that the industry's never been able to play with before because they simply weren't scalable solutions, even though the products were interesting. So we can actually deliver on those and bring a new natural color palette to the traditional ones of alizarin and indigo, Tyrian purple, those things that we know for thousands of years. I think the exciting thing is all the colors that we've never been able to see and touch that exist in nature.
That's amazing. And you did mention you guys have a collaboration with Basecamp. Can you talk a little bit about that?
We can't go into a huge amount, but I can tell you it's towards improving some of our products on cotton specifically. As I mentioned, the cotton is the one area where we need to improve our product portfolio. It will be towards improving some of that.
And I think of Basecamp as looking for non-model organisms for very specific applications. Is that right?
Also, and bespoke enzyme evolution and tailoring and a host of other interesting things that they're doing at the moment. I think there is a lot of potential there.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much, Orr, for your time today. This was a great conversation.
Oh, one thing that you asked me in the email that we haven't covered is the favorite tech film. I actually put a lot of thought into that. I'd like to share with you. So the film is called The Man in the White Suit. So it's 1951, black and white film. So not for everybody, but definitely worth a watch, as I haven't seen many films that look at science and industrialization with so much comedic accuracy.
Wow. That's one I haven't heard before. So I can't wait to check that out.
Wow. And black and white, so no colors. So it must have been refreshing for you.
Yeah, it's not something I usually engage in, given color is everything now. But that movie really was special and resonated, particularly with us as it's in textiles. But it should resonate with most, if not all, scientists, because once you see it, you'll get it.
Got it.
Cool. Thank you so much for the recommendation.
Excellent.
Oh,
Thank you so much, Orr.
Thank you so much, Karl and Erum. Pleasure.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Enjoy the rest of your day. So, Erum, what do you think of that interview with Orr?
Orr really has the whole industry mapped out, and the technology that they've created to make dyes in this novel way is just incredibly necessary. I mean, the way that he positioned his company, I mean, they've been working on it for over 8 years. He has deep experience in biology, as you can tell, and his background. He has a PhD in bioelectronic interface. So it was interesting to hear his early research in biosensors. He's a pro. He's a professional. It's just great to hear that he's helping transform the textile industry to start thinking of using dyes in a biomanufactured way versus the very, very harsh way that it's made today.
Yeah, I had mentioned in the intro that dyes are pretty toxic. There's one class of dyes, the ones that produce like the really beautiful reds and oranges and yellows. They're called azo dyes. They're actually synthetic, so made from oil plus who knows what else. And they're one of the most commonly used groups of dyes, and they're known to be toxic and carcinogenic. So not only for the people that are dyeing the clothing, but then all that water that gets flushed into the system. So there are places, for example, in Bangladesh and India, where you've got these dead zones in the environment because of all of this pollution that happens thanks to the textile industry. So hearing Orr's story is incredibly inspirational. And the fact that he has gone into these textile mills with his machinery and his dyes, and they've been welcomed basically with open arms is incredible. I think it's just another example of making a technology easy to understand, going out to the market and making it easy for them to adopt it. It's also something that we saw with some of the plastic manufacturers that we've had on the podcast. Sway and Material have these drop-in solutions. And I think that's really something that any aspiring entrepreneur should be thinking about. You don't want to reinvent a complete supply chain.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Drop in for now. And if you need to make adjustments along the way, make adjustments. But for now, we need change to happen fast. So, what's the infrastructure? What are the supply chains? And how can we just infiltrate those supply chains to be less toxic? Like, really, it's just amazing to hear the volume at which water's being used and the toxic dyes that are, business as usual. And hopefully, Orr and his company, they're starting to change it, but change it on a bigger scale. So I hope that more textile companies, those dyeing houses that he mentioned in the podcast, hopefully they know of Orr and they're supporting Colorifix's mission and with open arms. And like you said, because there's a whole social component, right? No one wants to work with toxic materials every day because they know the long-term effects of these things. If you inhale it, if it touches your skin, and knowing that if the life cycle of this material is going to harm the environment. So what can be done? People want these solutions. I don't know if we're like in our little echo chamber in Brooklyn. Our podcast is streamed all over the world. So hopefully people from other places also feel the sentiment and this call to action to change things. We can't accept business as usual. It's not okay to harm the environment, use toxic chemicals to make money. This is just very, very sad. Sorry to be a bummer, but that is the way the world's working. But the hopeful and exciting thing is that people like Orr and Colorifix, they have these solutions and we just need to embrace them because not only is it replacing what is business as usual, but it can enhance it. And that's the beauty of biology because there are new performance characteristics that can be unveiled with biotechnology. So there's definitely win-wins all around when we talk about biology.
So you had mentioned at the top of the episode that I've known Orr for a while. I feel like Orr and I have been around each other for at least a few years. I feel like I got to know him a couple of years ago at a London event. I think it's the power of just talking to people and networking. And we had an episode a couple of weeks ago that was specifically about networking that has gotten some good comments from people. So thank you to all of you who've listened to that episode and have gotten back to us and told us that you enjoyed it. We also enjoyed doing it. Any comments on that episode, Erum?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been hearing it from some people saying that the networking episode was just really good. I think it hit home to a few people that network for a living. I mean, a lot of people that are in sales or a lot of investors that are talking to startup entrepreneurs. They see some of the challenges startup entrepreneurs might be having, or they themselves have to network with entrepreneurs and want to make sure that they're doing a good job and there's a solid value exchange. And if you haven't listened to the episode, I highly recommend it, especially if you're going to Synbio Beta. I think this is the last episode where we're going to talk about attending because it's going to be happening next week. So give it a listen. It's a good thing to have in your back pocket as you attend, whether it's Synbio Beta or other events. It's just good tips and a mental state to be in before you hit up an event.
So this is your last chance to save $300 if you're going to go. Use the Grow Everything code when you sign out, and you can save a little bit of money. We do know there's been a lot of last minute signups to the event. We look forward to seeing you there. I don't know if there's anything else we want to mention.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's going to be a lot going on. Shelby talked about it a little bit in the last episode. What are you excited to see at SynBioBeta? This is your millionth time going. Just want to be accurate with numbers there. So what are you excited about?
I'm super excited to see the companies that are focused on gene and cell therapy, because I think that's an exciting space to be in. We know that on this podcast, we've done a lot of conversations around biomaterials. I'd like to see more of the companies that are working on tools that are going to enable both the creation of biomaterials and also therapeutics. And protein engineering, we're working with a company in that space, which I think is a really exciting space because it touches all industries. And then more than anything, I think it's just fun to catch up with friends. So my voice today is already a little bit not doing so well. It'll be worse after SynBioBeta, but luckily I've got a couple of days to rest in between.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm so excited to see our friends. SynBioBeta brings out the most interesting people with just crazy ideas. Next week's episode, stay tuned for Elliot Hirschberg, amazing VC in this space. He has great overview. So if you go to SynBioBeta, that's the one that you want to listen to at the end. It's a great wrap up. And then we'll be back after SynBioBeta to talk about what happened there. So stay tuned.
Sounds good. Okay, that's the pod.
Bye.